When something moves during an exposure, it will record with motion blur. Now, how much motion blur depends on the speed of the subject, the distance from the lens, and also the shutter speed that you use. So let's have a look at how that works. This first technique is where you deliberately blur the static background, but not the moving subject. This is called panning, and the idea is to follow the subject as it moves, keeping it relatively still within the frame, and this means that the background itself is moving fast within the frame, so it blurs instead of the subject. I use manual focus, and I lock it on a spot where the subject is likely to be. Then, using a shutter speed of maybe 1/8 of a second, I swing round at the same speed as the subject is passing, keeping the subject mostly still within the frame. As they say, your mileage may vary, and the success rate will be low at first, but pixels are free, so keep shooting until you have a keeper. The zoom motion blur effect is more of a trick than anything else, but it does give you a sense of implied movement and drama to an otherwise static subject. You will need a proper zoom for this, of course. The 24-90 or the 16-35 on the SL is absolutely ideal. So let's have a look at some pictures and see how it works. Set up a shot where you can use a shutter speed of maybe 2 seconds or longer. Cities at night work well here. Then, using the 2-second self-timer, trigger a shot and about halfway through the exposure, smoothly turn the zoom ring on the lens to magnify or to zoom in. This will give you a half sharp and half exploded view for added drama. And it's quite simple, but it is hard to do well. You'll need to shoot a few frames with varying amounts of zoom to get an effect that you like. For the long exposure motion blur technique, the idea is to keep the camera absolutely static on a tripod, use a relatively long exposure of maybe 1 second or more, and let the subject naturally move during the exposure so it records as a line rather than a sharp point. Let's have a look at some pictures and I'll show you what I mean. Traffic at night works well. The lights on vehicles record as long, bright lines, and you can have fun with different length exposures. The other classic long exposure, of course, is waterfalls, where the falling water looks like a feathery mist rather than sharply frozen droplets. In full daylight, you will not be able to achieve a shutter speed slow enough to record movement in a pleasing way, and this is where the strong neutral density filters come in. A 10 stop filter will force shutter speeds to be much slower, and so moving objects can record as blurs, even clouds if the exposure is really long. UNSHARP blur is where you use a mixture of panning techniques and relatively short exposures on a very fast moving subject to get a sense of drama and action, even if the rest of the picture is quite blurry. Let's look at some examples. This technique is a little bit hit or miss, and you will need to repeat it over and over again to get the result that you want. This image of motorcycles in Vietnam was shot at 1/4 of a second, which has left the centre bike sharp-ish, but has left the other bikes really blurry. There is a really strong sense of hustle and bustle here, which is better captured like this than as a sharply frozen image.